There's the joke that the professor always says, which is reading the card explains the card, which used to be like telling somebody to read the card because it tells you how to play it. That doesn't work anymore.
Distraction makers.
Cruft is when there's a game and it's got a lot of extra components to it that are necessary to actually play the game. Information that is you cannot have without these additional pieces, or it's pieces that maybe just are assumed, right? Most people don't write their life total in Magic. They have a phone or they use a 20-sided die or something like that. That is kind of Cruft in a way.
Right. And part of this is we're trying to define what this is because we see this thing emerge, and maybe there is a term for this already, but we think Cruft is a pretty good
term.
Right. And I think the way to sort of decide whether or not something is Cruft is if you look at the system level stuff of your game, and then it's any kind of additional components that you need for the game to function.
Yeah.
And they may or may not be necessary, right? And I think at Cruft at its worst, those components actually could be simplified to act within the systems that are already part of your game.
Right.
Magic has, in recent years, added a lot of extra components to the game, right? You have things like Venture into the Dungeon. You have The Ring Tempts You. You have Monarch. You have...
there's a lot of in the game.
Yeah, there's a lot of extra stuff happening. And we were kind of looking for a term for this type of thing because it's something that comes up often in any game design.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is you're for Magic, it's because like they're looking for new design space, right? Like you at some point are sort of constrained by just the boundaries of the game, and so moving outside of those boundaries is something that will inevitably happen. But Magic's been around for over 30 years now.
Yeah.
So when we see it in like a newer game, that's when we're kind of suspect, right?
I think there's a lot of players that probably see a lot of the latest stuff. In particular, we can list it off, but Ring Tempts You, Dungeons, all these things. Excuse me. And I think that it's easy to be upset with Wizards for adding all these extra pieces of Cruft, but to play devil's advocate, to be on Wizards' side for a second, if you really consider how most video games work, for instance, Cruft, considering it as an extra thing outside of an existing video game system, right? The common gameplay loop that you'd be going through. It's very common for most games when there's new DLC or new patches or whatever to just be filled with what could be considered the video game version of Cruft in this way.
Yeah.
The fact that Magic has been going for 30 years and we're just now kind of being like, it's a bit much, guys, is insane.
Yeah.
Like 30 years is so long to be doing this. And for us to just now be like, it's getting to be a lot of pieces is like pretty good.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, look, I've harped on it before. I will say it again. A lot of this comes from the fact that a rotating format is not the way that the game is being played. And so you don't have this ability to continually renew the playing environment in the way that we did previously.
Okay. So when I think it's important to know, when is Cruft beneficial? When is it not Cruft, right? When is it just added components that are crucial and sometimes preferred for the overall design versus something that is just flat out negative and feels like Cruft?
Right. Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to continue that.
I'm still trying to figure it out myself.
Yeah. So for me, when so I'm working on my newest game, Bolts and Teeth and Aliens, we have a currency in the game. And we have gone back and forth as to whether or not we should keep, I keep flicking this, we should keep that in the game or not.
Yeah.
And it is buying us more, it's buying us a means of balancing what we have. We have like upgrade cards that you buy with this currency. And it's buying us a way to balance those upgrade cards. And if we didn't have these, then we wouldn't be able to have like upgrades that cost more than one. It's like you would just get the upgrade. You don't have any means of exchange, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that instance, that's one of the reasons why I think that it becomes a justified piece of the system instead of Cruft. The idea of design is that you want to remove as much as you can and nothing more. So
for the experience.
For the experience,
yes.
Yeah. For whatever it is you're trying to communicate or in game design, it happens to be an experience.
Right.
So you want to try to remove as much as possible, but if you remove one thing too many, there starts to become these trade-offs, right? Like I'm talking about, we have these upgrades that if we don't have they're called psi coins, but whatever, that's the currency. If we didn't have psi coins, we have no way to balance the upgrades. So instead, you would just be delivered a random upgrade, and that would just be what you get. And sometimes that's going to be really strong, and sometimes that's going to be weaker. And that's a particular type of experience.
Yeah.
And that could be the experience that we're trying to create, but it doesn't quite fall in line with what we're trying to do. So we're saying, okay, well, we need this means of exchange, this currency, this cruft now becomes justified in that it serves a purpose that without it, that purpose is not fulfilled any longer.
Yeah.
So I think that's when it's justified. Another reason why it might be justified is flavor.
I think flavor is a huge thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when you look at a lot of Magic's examples in particular, most of them are justified via flavor, right? The one ring and the ring tempting you in the Lord of the Rings set, for those that don't know, it is a mechanic that on a card will just say the ring tempts you. However, let's say if you're a viewer that does not play Magic, me saying the ring tempts you, you're probably wondering, what the hell does that do?
What does that do? Yeah.
Well, you won't know unless you have a ring card that says what happens when the ring tempts you, or you have your phone and you look it up.
Right. There's the joke that the professor always says, which is reading the card explains the card, which used to be like telling somebody to read the card because it tells you how to play it. That doesn't work anymore.
Right.
And that's why it's become a meme.
And I think in some cases it's justified. Personally, I don't know if the ring tempts you was quite in that realm. Dungeons or something, it's a little bit more interesting. Dungeons are these separate cards that you get where something says it ventures into a dungeon, and there's literally all these different dungeon cards,
rooms
and
in the
have
dungeon.
rooms, and you can decide to go through it and stuff. So all of those are flavor driven decisions, which are great. I think the times that Cruft gets to be a little heavy-handed is when I think some designers can get a little too caught up in decision-making in games, and feeling like they want to offer all of these different vantage points and opportunities for players to strategize and think about, what routes they're going to go into a particular game, how they're going to win.
Right.
And I think in doing so, you can find a lot of games that end up having a lot of extra components.
Your possibility space ends up growing based on components rather than the interaction of the components that you have. And I think that is foundational to game design, is understanding that you don't necessarily need to add more components. You might need to look at your systems level and say, okay, how can I get these components that I currently have to have more vectors of interaction?
Right. And there's tons of games that do this in a very streamlined way. And in fact, I think my favorite example of a game that does this in a very, very streamlined way is Carcassonne.
Yeah.
Carcassonne is a fantastic example of a game that has the minimal amount of craft possible and is a very streamlined, very simplified game, but has a lot of strategy and decision making in each action that you do on your turn. I highly recommend it to anyone that's interested in design in general. I think flavor wise, there's stuff to be desired, but that's besides the point. That's not really what we're getting into.
Right. And I do think that, we're talking about flavor and Cruft bringing in a level of flavor potentially justifying its existence. That's like games that sort of purely become like a system expression. That's kind of the thing I think you're hitting on with Carcassonne is that Carcassonne doesn't really feel like you're doing much of anything. You're sort of drawing tiles and then placing them, and what is that? Like, what are you doing? I guess you're exploring a territory, and that's representational of it. But sometimes in order to get rid of the cruft, you end up abstracting an experience so far that it doesn't really evoke the feeling that you're necessarily trying to achieve.
Yes. And in fact, we talk all the time about Everdell. Yeah. Everdell's a game that, in my opinion, the way that I design games, I think it's a little too heavy on craft. I think it's got a lot of components, a lot of moving pieces. But the thing that everyone always talks about when they play Everdell is how great the little pieces are.
Yeah.
It's a game that does not necessarily need to have these little individual tiny pieces that you get. It's like little resource components. You can look it up. But what's so funny is that looking it up, it doesn't, like in most other games, you can look it up and see, oh, that's what those little pieces are.
Yeah.
But in Everdell, like it's all tangible. Everything has a different like material. So like the berries are like little and squishy and rubbery, and everything just feels really good.
So good
to use it, and it matches the theme, which is cutesy woodland creatures. I think another example of that is Flamecraft. In that Flamecraft is a game that I think a lot of people really, really enjoy, and flavor-wise, the components. You have to do this with a straight face.
So some people really enjoy Flamecraft.
The components in Flamecraft are very cute, fit aesthetically with everything else.
That is very true.
Everything feels very cohesive in that way. That I think is what is most attractive to people that end up playing that game in particular. And so I do think it is a big balance, because Flamecraft is like it's a big game. There's a lot of components to it.
Yeah.
Everdell also, it's a smaller game than Flamecraft, but it's still got a lot of components to it. But I think that it is up to the designer to justify like what is worth having these added components, and does that actually add to the overall experience of this game?
Right. So much of this does have to do with target audience. And I think one of the reasons why Magic might be venturing into this space a little bit more is because the Commander starts to hit into a like a board game audience, right? I feel like Commander starts to bridge that gap a bit. And a board game audience is much more used to this kind of design, in that like this is one of the reasons why I really don't like a whole lot of board games is that the craft really bothers me, especially when like there's a lot of setup. There's just a lot of like you gotta do a lot of stuff before you get to play the game.
Yeah. And
you know, I have a very Magic informed perspective. My setup is I want to sit down, shuffle my deck, and start playing. Right, like, and to know that you can get such a fulfilling experience out of just that makes me go, why would I want to spend, you know, a half an hour setting up a game to play it for an hour, when I can spend 3 minutes setting up, you know, shuffling my deck and playing a game of Magic. So, you know, it's interesting. I do think that there's like, especially things like the Monarch. I think Monarch is like really top notch, great for Commander.
It's a Commander-driven design,
right?
So,
and it came from another Richard Garfield game, vampire game. I can't remember.
Vampire something.
Bloodlines.
That sounds right.
Something. I don't know. I'll put it up on the screen or whatever. But yeah, it came from another game that Richard Garfield designed, or at least worked on. Especially in Magic, I think that venturing too far into this territory has some sort of extra consequences that doesn't necessarily happen. Like other games don't have it quite as much. I think Magic in general, don't get me wrong, Magic has a lot more room to sort of absorb this kind of stuff because it has so little at its base systems.
Yeah.
But you know, when you're like venturing into territory where, you know, you need 50 different tokens to play your deck,
right?
You can make that choice as a player, I guess. But you know, you're trying to play a game of Commander, and you know, somebody has their Venture in the Dungeon deck, somebody has their Lord of the Rings deck, somebody has their Monarch deck, somebody has, you know,
and the fact that one deck could have all of these,
right? One deck,
could
I'll be one deck, yeah. And then when you're trying to get a new person into the game, like the ring tempts you, and not being able to explain what that means on one card, you're sort of paying the consequence of like it's harder to get people to learn the game.
And I think that this is funny because this kind of contradicts. I think some people could see this as a little bit contradicting to how we were discussing parasitic design in one of our recent videos, because we talked about how our idea is that we really enjoy that when you have a set that's specifically designed with mechanics that are only based around cards within that block or set of cards, that you can get a lot of flavor. You can get like a very specific, unique experience for that. But I think that, and I think like the ring tempts you is something that does that. I think it's justification, right? It's like we have these Lord of the Rings sets. We have this one mechanic, and that's the main one, and it's just about the ring. And I could see that as a justification for it. Right. I think it gets trickier when, you know, there's, like you're saying, there's all these different types of decks. And I think that Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just getting more into that eternal format problem.
Right. Yeah. Well, and like if you look at the ring tempts you and you try to think of a different way they could have solved this, like, okay, well, let's say just all of these cards are level up cards and like they get tempted by the ring in different ways. Is that more flavorful? Kind of, but like it limits the amount of design space for those cards then, right? Like now you can just say the ring tempts you on the card and that references a whole different card. Similar to like if you had a transform card or something, it's just that they're separate cards instead of being on the back of the card, which is being on the back of the card is definitely more elegant. But if you think about like, okay, well, you know, these cards that interact with the being tempted by the ring, if it would then limit that type of ability to specific cards rather than you get the effect on any card. Right? It makes it more parasitic, I guess, right? They made it less parasitic doing it the way that they did. Yeah. And I do wonder if that's kind of the thing that they're running up against.
Yeah, is, trying to make things less parasitic.
Right, because you can instead just put the ring tempts you, and that does something different that doesn't need anything else. It can exist on its own. If you get tempted by the ring once, you get an effect. If you venture into the dungeon once, you get the effect. Yeah. And if you only have one card that ever does that, it doesn't matter. Right? You don't need like, okay, well, I have this card that levels up or whatever when it's tempted by the ring.
You need a card then that tempts you. Yeah. In order to do that.
Yep.
And I think that for anyone that's like interested in this sort of like Cruft justification and thought process and stuff, Mark Rosewater has talked about the design of the Lord of the Rings sets on his Drive to Work podcast, and it's very fascinating because I really like what he's been doing lately. He's been bringing on different designers from each set of design or each discipline of design.
I haven't been listening for a while, so I need to catch back up.
Yeah, so it starts with, I think he starts maybe with like R&D or vision design or something, and then works down into like set and play design.
Yeah.
And it's very fascinating when you hear each individual discipline's struggles with the ring, because what they ended up finding is like they wanted that ring to be this thing is very evocative, very thematic, and they thought, okay, well, it could pass around the table in this way, right? That like the ring is tempting all these different people, or someone is having the ring. And then they also kind of thought, well, we wanted this like negative, like this drawback to having the ring, right? You have it, and it just makes you feel powerful, but there's like a cost to having that. And that caused issues in like play design, because suddenly you have this negative interaction and now no one wants to play it. Like no one wants to use it if it's too difficult. So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of justification, and it's very difficult to design for things like this. But I think taking the amount of care and consideration that Magic did with something as simple as this one mechanic for this double set that they have is what you should be doing for every bit of Cruft,
right?
Or every added component in your game if you're designing it,
right? Yeah, and definitely really taking a hard look at like, well, if this is the beginning of the game, right? This is the least complex the game will ever be.
Yeah, right.
So if you are trying to build something that isn't just a one-off, it's something that grows over time, you have to start with what is literally the most simple that this game can be and start from there.
Yeah.
And don't worry, the game's interactions will be the thing that creates the possibility space. Or at least it should.
It should be. If it's not, that's a problem with the game.
Right.
Right.